So welcome everyone to this OTF Connects webinar, part of our series of What Works for Me Might Work for You. I'm your behind the scenes host and moderator for today's session, Ian Pettigrew. I'm a member of the senior staff at OTF. I'm glad that you could join us on what is, for me here in Waterdown, a sunny afternoon. I hope it is for you too. And we're delighted to have you join us today. So as we begin, I'd just like us to acknowledge that we are gathered in the territories of various Indigenous peoples, and we further acknowledge their stewardship of these lands in which we live, learn, work, and play. And now I wanted to offer a few words about today's webinar facilitator, Neil Andersen. Neil is president of the Association for Media Literacy in Ontario, one of our provincial subject associations. He has taught primary to post-secondary media studies for over 30 years, including media studies AQ courses for Mount St. Vincent University, York University, U of T, and the Toronto District School Board. He has delivered keynotes and workshops across Canada, in the US, India, and China, Australia, England, and Sweden. He has made movies and videos, authored student textbooks, journal articles, teacher resource books, over 200 study guides, and designed t-shirts, posters, interactive CDs, websites, and programs. Neil's writings include Media Literacy's Gifts to Literacy Study, Why Social Media Literacy, Media Literacy Education in Ontario, and How Might Context Influence Media Literacy Education. His awards include the Jesse McCancy Award from the National Telemedia Council and the Magic Lantern Award, gotta be a cool award, sounds great, from the Association for Media Technology and Education. And I could go on, but that would eat into our precious time this afternoon with Neil. So welcome, Neil, and over to you.
Thank you. So if this is working the way I want it to work, then you should see
and we do.
The title of the webinar. Okay.
All set.
That's a great start. That's a great start. There are people I know who like to have their own version, and they can find that on the AML website. If they just take a look for the OTF Integrating English in Media, they can download that now, or they can download that after the fact.
I'll put the link in the chat box for them, Neil.
Thank you. Thank you. So as a disclaimer, I am an expert, as Ian pointed out, but I'm not an expert in online education in particular, because I only did it for 4 weeks strictly online. Prior to that, for 10 years or so, I've been doing partial art online on the various courses, the AQ courses that I've been teaching, but not fully online. And so I think it's entirely possible that there are some people listening to me who know as much or more than I do, and I'm willing to admit that. So what I am going to do is give you recounting the documentation of my adventures, and hopefully that you will find some of that useful. I'd also, this is my CV, which Ian has already covered, so never mind that. I'd also like to do a shout out for the podcast that I'm doing with Carol Arcus, and it's on every Monday at 8 o'clock. And we hope that you will join us, because we have very useful media literacy conversations, which are useful to both parents and teachers. I'm going to talk about grade 10 English. And these were people at the Scarborough Center for Alternative Studies. So even though it was a grade 10 English class, they were adults. Not that I would make significant changes, I just think it's useful or important for you to know that. What happened was we had done 5 weeks of face-to-face classroom work. Then we had the 3 weeks of the March break, and I don't have to tell you about that. And then we went back for 4 weeks online, and we were given about 3 days notice that we were going to be going online. I had imagined all kinds of things, but I hadn't really thought about that. So we went. And so for me, in order to figure out what I needed to do in short order, was I devised this question. And I thought about this interaction, which is what I've done most times when I'm writing study guides, textbooks. This is the way that I approach it. And so in this particular case, I'm looking at students, curriculum, and media. And in the case of my SCAS students, they were ESLD adults. And I had decided I was going to do a narrative unit in the grade 10 English. And I had the world of media that I could work from. And so it was pretty exciting for a media studies teacher to be doing that. Ian, can we do the first poll, please?
You bet. Here it comes. Okay, everyone. So there's a poll that's going to appear on your screen, and I'll just ask you to take that. It is anonymous, and I'm going to share the results with everyone after we've had folks take the poll. So here comes poll number 1.
I'm going to continue while those responses come, or are they going to just?
I'll let you know when we've got all the responses in.
Yeah, I think that's best. Otherwise, we'd be losing time here. So we were told we were going to be able to do synchronous and asynchronous. We were told not to use Zoom, and we were told not to give the students more than 3 hours of work per week. So I started thinking about my curricular options. And in terms of input, I was thinking about online short stories. Colleagues shared about 20 short stories that I could work with. I thought about YouTube narratives. Vimeo National Film Board has many, many, as you know, and there are also narratives on podcasts. And in terms of output, I thought about written assignments, oral presentations, which I had been doing with the students when we were working face-to-face, graphics, which I had also used, and then videos and podcasts, which we had not used, but I realized would be a possibility. Then I started to think about the logistics.
Neil, I can share results whenever you're ready. Let me know.
Great, please.
Oh, yeah, here it comes.
Okay.
Great, thanks everyone.
That's great, thank you. So when I thought about the logistics that I had to work with, I realized that I had ESLD learners, some of whom were very, very proficient in English and some not at all, that they were working with smartphones in many cases, no library access because, as you know, students like to use libraries and the internet connections there. That meant that they were going to have variable bandwidth, hardware, software, and for these students in particular, challenging home environments because some of my students are parents and some of them are working, and that meant that they had to deal with their own children's online education in grade 3 or 4 or 5, as well as their own. So when I put that all together, I decided to go this way. I decided to use as resources because I had looked at Edgar Allan Poe short stories and F. Scott Fitzgerald short stories that were offered to me, and I thought, considering their language skills, they're going to find that very difficult. Why can't I use them as the resource? We're talking about people that have experienced thousands of stories in a variety of media over their lifetime, and we'll just tap into those. And I hope I'll be able to illustrate what I mean by that. I also decided I would have them do 4 tasks, 1 in each of the weeks, but I would give them choices. And so I would ideally do 10 tasks. And when I started working on it, I realized that was unrealistic and ended up with 6. I did, however, put in 1 story task. And so I wanted them to work from stories they already knew. These could be familiar stories. And therefore, part of their experience would be familiar. They didn't have to read and learn a new story. They could just start to apply some of the English and language concepts to a story they already knew. I gave them a choice so that they could demonstrate their best skills. So this is my attempt at online differentiation. And I decided to make it, I decided to give them one because I knew that some of these students had come from the English-inspired education system, and they would be expecting one. So I gave them one online story in addition to tapping into their own prior knowledge. And I decided to go with written assignments because I decided it was most equitable. It was the logistical demonstration, and it would allow me to give them asynchronous feedback. So this is the way it looked in Google Classroom. And it's in reverse order because that's the way Classroom presents things. So the story moment assignment was mandatory. The beginning survey was a survey and not an assignment. And then all of the others were the optional. And so they chose one per week. And that means, of course, that there were at least two that they never did. And that was up to them to choose which one those would be. As I continued to develop the stories, they became 7 parts. They didn't start out at 7 parts. They started out about 3. But as I continued to think about them and think about them from the students' points of view, I realized that they were going to have to be rather compartmentalized in 7 different parts. And you'll notice that 2 of them are the same part. And the task description was in fact the same, but I wanted them to be able to see it very early so that they could see what they were being asked to do, and to see it again after I had shown them an exemplar and a metacognitive piece. And I will be explaining that. So this was the mandatory assignment, and this is the overview that they would read. And you can see that I have English and media literacy learning goals. In the exemplar, I showed them a picture that I had found in image search of the King and the Queen's visit to Canada in 1939. And I chose that because I didn't want to show them something I thought one of them might end up doing. And I thought that was a pretty long shot considering this is 1939, that they might do a royal visit of more recent times or some other royal situation, since there was lots of good story opportunities there. And so in this one, I explained that depending on your point of view, the hero and the villain might switch. That to Mackenzie King, he would be the hero and the King and the Queen would be the villain, because they were trying to get him to commit Canadian lives and materials to a war. Only 20 years earlier, they had fought and had the pain of World War I, and he didn't really want to put Canada back into that. For the King and the Queen, they were the hero and he was the villain because they were trying to convince him to support England. And I put in the rising action as these veterans that they're meeting, because they were actually using the veterans as leverage and the veterans' love of them to force him to make that decision. So this is the picture that I showed them, and I gave them an explanation. And that was the exemplar. Then I moved on to another assignment, personal stories. You can read the overview here. Then one on character. One on favorites, which was an opportunity to talk about aesthetics. One on cautionary tales. And so they could think about hegemony and the values messages in stories. And then finally, the one where I supplied the short story, which was a little bit more of the standard lesson that you might see. And as I said, I had a hard time choosing one because the language and the formats were pretty challenging for these students. And so as I cast around, I found a Stuart McLean story. And it was in Chatelaine magazine, and I was able to cite that. And so I was able to get around the copyright. And that satisfied the collection. So these are the English learnings that collection of lessons were addressing. And these are the middle media literacy learnings. Now I'm going to come back to those lessons a little more specifically, but I'd like to talk about management because I think that's been a real challenge. And so I used surveys and feedback. And Toronto uses Google, and Google allows you to use something called forms. And I just did 10 questions. I didn't want it to become too onerous, but I put out one survey at the beginning of each week, partly just to let the students know that I was there and that they had some connection the way they have when you say hello when they walk into the classroom. And Google allows you to make up a variety of questions. So they can be short answer or quick multiple choice or linear scales, and you can use that variety. It also will connect the answers to the surveys to a spreadsheet and collect them automatically and populate the spreadsheet. And so I was able to use this as a way of getting feedback, solicited feedback, and use that feedback. In one, I was able to find out how many of the students were using smartphones. And that was my reason for not making the assignments too onerous, because they were having to write written assignments on a smartphone, which is fun, not challenging. But I also put in an open-ended question that invited them to ask me questions. And then I used those questions in a class email. So when I got a question that I thought was useful or that other students probably would also have, I copy and pasted it into a class email. And it was a way of having a good back and forth with the students. I also used video conferencing. So I put a question in the survey as to time of day. Now I used 3 times of day because I had students who were working or who were obligated to look after their children. And so I actually had 3 conferences, not every day. I did this once a week. So as you can see, this one's for Tuesday. So the survey went out on Monday, and I had video conferences on Tuesday. Anybody who was interested could log in at their preferred time and have a conversation. And the nice thing too was that I broke it down into smaller groups, so I wasn't talking to the entire class at any given time. I discovered that I could embed those surveys into the email. So on Monday, they would get an email. It would give them an overview of what was going on, what they needed to think about, where they should be in the course. And then as an attachment at the bottom, there was a survey. And then they clicked on that, filled out the survey, and it was automatically collected and tallied. And then I could use that feedback. I also created a mini lesson at the beginning because I had no idea what narrative experience these students had. So I wrote something that would be maybe a little bit like a lecture for a face-to-face classroom that explained the ways that narrative work and can be used in our lives. And you'll see that the font size is pretty big. In fact, I used 18. And I did this very intentionally because I looked at what this was going to look like on a smartphone. And I had to make it 18 so that it was really readable on the smartphone. So you have to think about the interface and what the students are going to be seeing when they get your work. So it's a good idea to double check how it's going to appear on the devices they're using. I also produced this as a video because as I've been working with my students, I have read them all of the assignments so that they hear it as well as read it. This helps those second language students. It helps those second dialect students. And I wanted to continue to do that. It turns out that there are specific devices, we will call them codes and conventions, in good stories that appeal to people. One code is a hero whom people can admire and identify with. A smart storyteller gives us a hero whom we find attractive, both physically and mentally, and can project ourselves onto as they travel through the story's adventures. The hero should be good, but not too good. We're more interested in imperfect heroes. Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have played many different heroes in many different stories. They are attractive people that we can identify with. So that went on, and they could watch that or not watch it. They could watch it more than once if it was good for them. And that was intended as scaffolding support. Now, when you're recording video, there are some challenges because you think I'm just going to turn it on, I'm going to share my screen, and away I go. Accepting that Google Meet wants you to have a real meeting, which means there has to be at least somebody else in the room. You can see that the share button there is gray, it's not blue. And so what I found I had to do in order to record the meeting was I had to invite another device. And so I recorded it on my laptop, but before I could do that, I had to invite my iPhone to join the meeting. And then Google would let me go ahead with that. So that was the workaround. And I actually learned that from someone else who had been doing it. I was also keen to do some teacher feedback. And so when I was doing the face-to-face classes, I would sit often with students and work with them one-on-one, one-on-two on their own writing and explain how to improve their writing. And I wanted to see if I could approximate that. If you go into Google Docs and you go to the suggesting mode, then when you make your suggestions, they come up in green and the student will understand what they need to do. However, I had some students do their work in Word and then hand it in. So now I couldn't load it into Google Docs unless it got converted, but it does let you convert it, and then you can make your comments in the margins instead of in the body. So I'm going to show you a sample task, and I've chosen the personal story one. And as I said, it comes in 7 parts. So this is the overview. Ian, can we do the other questions, please? The one about exemplars and about metacognitive?
Yeah, sure. They're in separate polls, so I'll launch one and then share the results of that and launch the second one. How does that sound?
Thank you.
All right, here comes the next one.
This is the introduction.
Okay, here comes the exemplar. Just one question. Here you go, folks. Feel free to respond. I'm going to close the poll in 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here come the results.
Okay, great.
Okay, I can launch the second one if you want that one.
Yes, please.
All right, or this will be the third one. Sorry, folks. Sorry to confuse. Here we go. On metacognition, here it comes. One question. Please go ahead. I'll close the poll in 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there are the results.
Okay, that's great too. Thank you.
Okay.
So as I said, this is the introduction.
Neil, can I just interject for a minute, just for something for you to ponder? So one of the participants has asked about metacognition, what that means.
I will hope that when I get to it, it will answer that.
Perfect, thanks.
This was the task description. And this was the exemplar. This isn't the whole exemplar. This is just the beginning of it. But I'd like to point out that I used a different font and color here to distinguish, which I think is a media literacy strategy. And my exemplar ran about 6 short paragraphs, even though they were supposed to write 3 to 5. And this is the metacognitive part, which for them I called think aloud. And the idea was that I would explain what I was thinking about as I created the assignment, because I think very often students even look at exemplars and just say, well, how do you do that? I don't know what that's about. So I wanted them to understand what I was thinking as I did it. I wanted them to see that I had started with the success criteria so that I knew what my goals were, but then I explained what I was thinking as I worked it through. And again, I changed the color because I wanted to code it as something different. And you'll notice, I hope that the 3rd and the 4th bullets address the narrative. And this was really useful and interesting because I got a wide range of responses, and people really had reflected back on their lives and repeated stories from their grandparents, from their home, their first country. It really did work. So then I repeated the task description. This is the same one I had shown earlier. And I included the success criteria. And so all 6 of the tasks that I had created had those 7 parts. And that's part of why, even though I started out to write 10, I didn't get to 10 because it was a fair bit of work to put them all together and to go back and rethink them and provide all of those sections. Does that person now feel comfortable with the metacognitive part?
We'll wait to see if there's an answer in the chat box. Yes, thank you.
Good.
Perfect. Great. Thanks.
Good.
Thanks
I'm glad that.
The answer too.
Yeah, I'm glad that. So I've been a big believer in helping students be students. And what I mean by that is they need to understand that being a student is a job, and there are specific strategies that they can use, and they can start with the success criteria, but they can also understand that there is a metacognitive piece that will help them get the job done. So as I said earlier, I used the audience, purpose, and form. And I put audience on top because for me, it's students first. In my case, in this particular situation, ESLD adults, but also had to acknowledge their technical access. And of course, that's going to be true now, right through until the end of June, and we'll find out if it goes beyond that. And then when I was thinking about the purpose, I wanted to integrate narrative and media. And so in one of those assignments, they talked about their favorite movies, and that was pretty popular. But they started to rethink those movies in narrative terms. So they were reprocessing something that was familiar to them. Some of them had watched the same movie 10 times, and they started to understand what it was about the movie that they enjoyed so much. Same thing with the character assignment. And in the case of form, and I'm not endorsing Google products, despite the fact that it's all listed here. That was the Toronto District School Board choice, and I followed it. But I used docs, forms, video, sheets, Meet, Classroom, email, and then when it was necessary, I phoned students and we had one-on-one conversations if they were particularly confused or they were puzzled by something. So as I said, I have put all of these on the AML website, and you can go and download those at your convenience. And I invite you to try that audience purpose form paradigm. And I wish you luck as we make history in the next several months. Ian, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, that's great. If folks want to add some questions into the chat box, Neil's happy to take those on and see what we can do. We're practicing wait time, Neil.
Right, wait time online. Everything is new.
You got a nice compliment here. It says, don't have a question. That's, sorry, it's going fast here from Lila, sorry. Don't have a question. I'm a science teacher and I want to teach English now.
I did notice that we had a science teacher, and I was happy to see that, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I talked about would be applicable to doing science online.
Great. So here's a question. How long would you give them to revise their work to better align with the success criteria if need be? That's from Melanie.
Generally speaking, I was able to go back once. In other words, when they didn't meet the success criteria, I would give them that feedback. And a day or so later, they were able to turn it around and hand it in. We were directed to be extremely generous with deadlines because we were in such an unprecedented situation. And so one of the things that is new for online is that things straggle in or stagger in very intermittently. And for classroom teachers, you really like the idea of having a class set of papers or assignments to mark at one time, because you can calibrate your criteria and be more confident that you're giving a good assessment. That doesn't happen. You've got to be prepared to be assessing and evaluating a variety of things as they come. And as I said, you have to be available to the fact that some of them are going to come as Google Docs, and some are going to come as Word documents, and some of them are going to come as emails. There were students who weren't able to access the Google Classroom and actually emailed their assignments into me, and I just took everything that was coming. I think that's not just a fact of the current situation. I think that's going to be something we're going to have to be flexible with.
Okay. So this is probably a supplemental from someone else. But in terms of assessment and evaluation, do you find it's best, this is from Lindela, do you find it's best to establish the success criteria or have students determine them?
Too hard. I was only given 3 days to prepare this. I would always try to collegially establish the success criteria if I were in the face-to-face classroom, but it would be a lot easier to negotiate that. And we could have that in a real-time discussion. When you lose that opportunity, unless you're going to develop an assignment as a video chat, which is entirely possible, then I just decided I had to do it on my own.
Okay, thanks. So questions here about, it's a question really about evaluation. The question simply is, how about marks?
I'm sorry, I don't understand that question.
How about marks? So the marking of student work. So evaluation of student work. Assigning grades.
Oh. Well, I had the option of working with a rubric or success criteria. I don't enjoy making in rubrics. I don't enjoy working with them because they're just kind of like playing with an octopus, right? It goes in all directions. So I chose for the success criteria. And so I just used the success criteria the way a lot of students would, as a checklist. I looked at their assignments. I looked at the success criteria. If they met them, then they got a pretty good mark. If they were really weak in one area, then it would reduce their mark. In many cases, in my feedback, I literally copied and pasted the success criteria into their assignment and said, yes, 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 no, you haven't done this, and you need to do thus and so. And that was the way I gave them their feedback. And that way they knew they'd already achieved some of them, but they were then informed as to which they had to fix.
Okay, great. So let's tackle a few things around the tools that you've been using here. And just the first question that's come in is with English language learners, those students, what have you found to be the best medium to communicate, in which to communicate?
When I'm, well, I think most ESL teachers will know that one of the most effective ways to learn to speak the language is to watch television, which would suggest that if you can use video, and particularly now that YouTube is so good at putting subtitles on, translation titles on, if you use that so that students can both hear and see it simultaneously, I think that's a good way to support the ESL students. But as the face-to-face classroom teachers, I said, I always read my assignments to the students as they read with me.
Okay, great. So question, it's maybe related to that, and just generally in terms of providing supports for students. The question is from Faye, more visuals than written language, question mark.
I don't know if I would think in terms of a balance. I think I might think in terms of the language itself. And that was the reason why I rejected it. When I looked at the Edgar Allan Poe short story written in the late 19th century, it was impossible because the students just wouldn't understand the language. But even when I moved to mid-century and looked at the F. Scott Fitzgerald, that was tough. And so that's part of why I settled on the Stuart McLean, because that was probably early 21st century language. And so those were the criteria that I was applying.
Okay. So this is going to tap into your expertise in media literacy. So it's a question from Aaron. What do you think are the most relevant media literacy topics to cover in the secondary classroom? And where can we find the most relevant resources as teachers? And so I think you probably have another 45 minutes, right? See if we can tackle out a few of those, just a couple of ideas.
Well, I would suggest that Aaron listen to the Mediacy podcast, because we're trying to be dealing with current issues. For instance, about a year ago now, we did 2 or 3 podcasts on Old Town Road and how Old Town Road could be used in an English classroom. And I put a blog post on aml.ca explaining that as well. Now, Old Town Road is old. It's old Town Road, but it might still be useful. But it was the idea of rewriting the lyrics and understanding more about the song. And I think we can do that in other ways. There's a lot of fuss right now, of course, about fake news and what it is and how to ferret it out. But I think it's a lot more interesting to think about why people create fake news and why people share fake news. That's more interesting than figuring out why it's fake to me. And so that's a whole topic that you can have a great time with in an English classroom, because you can not only find fake news, you could create fake news. And as you create it, you actually learn how it works and why people like it and what makes it attractive.
Great. So let's take this the last official question of the webinar. But Neil, if you're prepared to stay on for just about 10 more minutes after the official end to take a few other questions, that'd be great.
Okay.
So here's the question. So something that I think everyone's thinking about, sort of that level of engagement online or virtually in emergency remote situations. Students seem to be overwhelmed based on the current situation. How then would you get them to be motivated in order to complete their tasks? So it's a question, I think, about keeping that level of engagement and motivation.
That's a good question. It's an important question, because in ways we have been disempowered and we are hiding out at home. We're told we can't go here, we can't go there. All kinds of rules that never existed have popped up. And so I think what we're missing is a feeling of agency, of control in our lives. And the response to that is to find some way of establishing some control in our lives. And so when we see the painted rocks out front of some homes, or we see artwork up in the windows, or we see people cooking and baking furiously, this is actually an attempt to do something, to have some agency. And so I think what we can do is to say, okay, I can't do 101 things I want to do, but what can I do? And how is that going to help? And so in some cases, people are making homemade masks because it makes them feel like they are having some more control. one of the really terrifying aspects of the situation we're in right now is that accepting for television newscasts where we see electron micrographs of viruses, we can't see the monster. We can't feel or taste or smell this monster. And so it makes us very afraid. What we need to do is to exercise the agency. And sometimes that agency can be a dramatic response, an artistic response, or just naming our fears. These things are okay. When people go into therapy, they go into therapy because they need to communicate. That's what therapy is. They are working with other people, either in a group or an individual therapy, but there's a lot of communication going on. And so that's really the advantage of English. English is a communication subject, and students can actually name and talk about and examine their feelings and their responses.
Okay, great, thanks so much. So I'll just use this as an occasion, Neil, to thank you very much on behalf of OTF and all the participants on the webinar, those who are joining us live and those who will tap into this in a asynchronous, on-demand format when it's archived. I want to thank you for generously sharing your wisdom and expertise and knowledge, and to model really the idea that we're all trying to navigate our way through an unprecedented time, historical time, and living that, and some of the opportunities and challenges that exist connected to that. I also want to take an opportunity to thank all of you as participants who've stayed with us here and who joined us, registered, and then came to participate live, and for your participation and active interaction with us today. We really appreciate that. This is obviously an example of why OTF believes in professional learning that is for teachers, by teachers, and Neil is one example of that. So in the next few days, you'll receive, as you can see from the screen, registrants for the webinar will receive a follow-up email with the link to an evaluation form for the webinar, and we really appreciate and value your feedback. We use it to support our current offerings and also to look ahead to future opportunities for professional learning as well. You'll also receive the link to Neil's PowerPoint slide deck, which is on the Association for Media Literacy website. It's right on the front page there. And there will also be a link to the archived version of this webinar. And I'll just remind you to visit the OTF Connects calendar for the schedule of other upcoming OTF Connects webinars as part of our series, What Works for Me, What Might Work for You. So thank you, everyone. And I know lots of you will be on to another part of your day. If you want to stay for a few minutes afterwards to chat with Neil, that's great. And we'll just end the PowerPoint, the webinar right here, the recording.
I'm grateful for the opportunity.